Hey Team Bio, welcome to your screencast on the cell cycle. So we're jumping from talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration to talking about how cells grow and divide, and then this will be followed by a unit on genetics and evolution. And all these things are connected. Obviously, the energy that the cell needs in order to grow and divide comes from cellular respiration. As well as indirectly from photosynthesis. Okay, so let's get right to it. The cell cycle is composed of two kind of discrete, or how do I want to call them? Most of the cell's life is spent in a phase called interphase. And the point at which it is actually dividing, splitting into two cells, is called mitosis and cytokinesis. And there are different components to mitosis and cytokinesis, as well as interphase, that we'll be discussing in class. We're going to really dive into the phases of mitosis in class tomorrow. And this screencast is mostly about what's happening in interphase when the cell is not actively dividing. So if we start out at the beginning of the cell cycle, right after a cell has split into two, we have a small cell. And it has two options. At this point, it can either enter what's called the G0 phase, or G0, where it will be no longer dividing. Or it can enter what's called the G1 phase, which is called G for growth or gap. In the G1 phase, it's doing all the normal cellular life stuff. Like cell respiration, and photosynthesis if it's a plant, protein synthesis, that you all have learned about. Remember the central dogma of biology: DNA to RNA to protein. Digestion, membrane transport, and osmosis. And so while it's doing all of these normal cell life things, it's also growing in size. And as you remember, as a cell grows in size, its surface area to volume ratio is decreasing. Okay, so if it's entering the G1 phase, it's going to be doing all of these things during the growth and gap period. And then additionally, if it's entered the G0 phase, where it's no longer growing and dividing, it's also going to be doing all of these normal cell life things, but it's not going to be progressing on to this next part of interphase, which is the S phase. The S phase stands for the synthesis. And what the cell is synthesizing in the S phase is DNA. The S phase is when DNA replication takes place. Now, we haven't talked about the mechanism of DNA replication, or we've talked really briefly about the structure of DNA and how it lends itself to being replicated. But we haven't talked about how that happens, and we're going to get to that when we discuss genetics. But for now, just know that during S phase, the DNA is being replicated. And then also during the S phase, the cell is doing normal life stuff. Whoop. And it's also growing in size. So I guess maybe you should have a little picture of the cell. At the end of the G1 phase, Franklin. Quiet. Franklin. No. Sorry about that. At the end of the S phase, the cell is bigger. And now it has 2 copies of every chromosome. I guess we'll write that in here. So in the nucleus, there'll be 2 copies of each chromosome. Okay. And then after the S phase, there's another phase called the G2 phase. And this is also growth or gap phase. And all the same things that are happening in the G1 phase are also happening in the G2 phase. So it's normal cell life stuff like this. And then it's also growing in size. And by the end of the G2 phase, the cell is as big as it's ever going to be. And then it enters mitosis and cytokinesis. Mitosis is specifically the division, actually I guess I'll write it here. Mitosis is the division of the chromosomes. And cytokinesis is dividing everything else. And those 2 things compose cell division. So yeah, the chromosomes that were duplicated during S phase each get sent to opposite sides of the cells. And so at the end of cell division, you have 2 cells that are exact copies of one another. The chromosomes have been divided up, and then the cytokinesis splits all the things that are in the cytoplasm. So I guess we can draw this out here, that mitosis and cytokinesis, when they occur, are going to lead to 2 cells, like so. And then this one is going to go off in this direction. So this one cell splits into 2. This guy and that guy. Okay, so that's the cell cycle. It's composed of interphase, which has 3 pieces, G1, S phase, and G2, and mitosis and cytokinesis, which is the division of the chromosomes and the rest of the cytoplasm. At the end of cell division, we have 2 cells that are genetically identical to one another, and often we'll have one cell dividing into 2, where maybe one of them is going to enter the G0 phase and the other one is going to keep staying in the cell cycle, going to interphase and then dividing again. Okay, that's all. In class tomorrow, you are actually going to be diving into mitosis and cytokinesis and figuring out the steps that compose these 2 phases of the cell cycle. See you in class on Wednesday.